Hello and welcome to the Doublethink Dialogues podcast. So it's 2024 and this is the year of the next American election. So we have incumbent Biden, of course, with Harris. We won't get into too much at the moment, at least of who's actually running the country. But it looks like it might be shaping up as Biden-Trump unless some shenanigans happen to stop Trump. But there are other candidates. So how much have you been following the American election then?
Very much in passing. It's my study of the American election is more that whenever I come to do some work or write some text on the library computer, I will deflect into watching the BBC news site. And so basically, it's a time wasting exercise for me to read all the international news there before I actually do anything.
So on the BBC, you're getting a highly filtered perspective of yes. American politics as well.
Yes, I mean, I suppose I do go somewhere where I see some Al Jazeera, but they have obviously been mostly focused on directly on the Middle East, rather not even going to what the outcome of how the Middle East will affect the election or the election will affect the Middle East.
Right. I guess one thing might be interesting to start with, because right now we're in the Republican candidate race. Such as you might call it. Most people don't really think it's much of a race, I think. But it kind of reminds me of, so we were just talking right before we started recording, and going back to the last Democrat candidate race, which was in sort of 2019, 2020. And the interesting thing there was that the Democrats always put themselves forward as the party of change, and in the current world, that also means the progressive party of representing women and minorities, and they had a large selection of women and minorities of candidates to choose from, and they went with the doddering old white man. So what did you make of that? Any thoughts on why they did that?
I wonder. I mean, I suppose they had a more progressive, but perhaps even more doddering old white man. They had the socialist chap, yeah. whose name now escapes me. But so that they didn't go for the very socialist option. But yeah, there was nothing conspicuously radical or forward-looking about somebody who, well, as far as I could see, is political, but he seemed to be very much immersed in Northern Ireland politics of the 1970s. He came out of his shell to tell the BBC he was Irish, so wouldn't speak to them. That was what struck me. It didn't seem a very forward-looking character.
Yeah.
I suppose I saw him presented at the time as the kind of sanity candidate against the view being strongly projected, but by his party, that Trump was a dangerous lunatic and should not be voted for on that basis.
Yeah, I do wonder if it's sort of maybe my brain goes on a lot of tangents. If you look at Hollywood, they've got into sort of sequelitis, right? They're very afraid to do any new blockbusters in many ways, right? They feel like it, even though they have been losing huge amounts of money on their sequels in the last few years, they still seem focused on doing sequels. Like they can't bring themselves away from that. Well, that's what worked, so it'll have to work. It'll work this time, right? Even though it doesn't. And it still felt like that. Like they had some, I think in 2020, they had the potential to have some candidates, some young, let's say young, diverse, to use the language, candidates. And they decided not to choose any of them, which was very strange to me. But if you're a corporation, more or less, as the political parties are, afraid of, in fact, they're all afraid of change inherently, aren't they? I think they probably feel they got burned with Hillary Clinton. Maybe, oh well, we tried an old white woman and that didn't work, so we better go back to the old white man, right?
On the thing. So, back to the original plot.
But as most people say, look, you got to put almost any woman in the country against Trump, and she probably would have done better than Hillary Clinton, because that's like the worst person you could have chosen almost. But so that kind of leads, I guess, to now the Republican Party I'm just trying to think of the candidates. You have, Donald Trump front runner, and then you've got Nikki Haley, and I have to look up his name, Vivek Ramaswamy, who I quite like listening to. I think he's quite on the ball, but he's quite a character. People are labeling him as Trump 2.0, I think. And then then you've got DeSantis and the rest of the sort of old white crew, as you might want to label them. But it's, I don't know. It's going to be a strange one, but it almost feels like this is going to be a sequel of 2020, doesn't it?
It has occurred to me before, and I think it was probably in the days of replacing Margaret Thatcher, that thinking, well, yes, there are loads of options. We've got all these other potential candidates, and look at each of them. They've got good points. And then you think, well, yes, but actually we only get one. You don't get a composite of all the best bits of all the alternatives. It has to be one person gets the job, and we haven't actually got one who maybe when we know them better, they have got more points. Although I think that the usual feeling has been that actually, when we know them better, we'll dislike them more. I remember some commentator being asked why some complete outsider was suddenly leading the field, and being told, well, that's because we don't know anything about him. As soon as we find out about him, we'll hate him as much as the rest. Yes.
Yeah. 2020 was also the election, despite what the media wants to force us to believe, was full of a lot of shenanigans, both before the election and after the election. And I keep trying to push this. People don't want to believe it, but there was an article in Time magazine, February 2021, written from the perspective of, we saved the democracy by destroying the democracy effectively, right? Kind of a discussion, admission, even if it's not satire, of corporate and political interests coming together to carefully manipulate people into certain positions, right? And subtly changing regulations in certain areas to make certain options more easily available. And so you combine that with the blatant censorship that social media was doing on a lot of topics, including, of course, the Hunter Biden laptop. And you come up with the conclusion that there was a lot of shenanigans to get, I'll use it here once, the establishment candidate in power. Now, the question that I have, and what I'm looking at for this election, more so than who actually wins, is how they end up winning. And I'm very curious to see what kind of shenanigans are going on behind the scenes to bring in the candidate that is let's say the desired candidate, quotes, by certain powers and groups, let's say. And I think that'll tell us a lot about the way that country and then potentially the world will move forward from that point. I don't know. Did you pay much attention to the 2020?
Yeah, I remember hearing what, to me, I'm not saying I saw actual evidence, but I remember hearing credible people talking about the statistics of the areas that Biden won, the convenience, the swings in various places being coincidentally just what was needed to bring it around, and saying that actually it wasn't delusion on Trump's part to think he was going to win. It actually looked, from the bigger picture immediately beforehand, it did look that way, and it was only seeing which bits went against that, a very convenient pattern of things that went against that swung it. So I have had, without being a conspiracy theorist or convert, I keep an open mind on the idea that he was robbed. And so might presumably be, the process might be in place to do that again, assuming he's still the outside candidate, assuming it is him, and assuming he's still the one they don't want.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, because I definitely believe that Trump was anti-establishment, and I believe Hillary Clinton was the candidate that was, let's say, chosen to win that election. And I don't believe that the establishment is one party or the other party. I see, in my view of what I perceive as the evidence, they use which party they want is more convenient. So if I look back, and I think it's particularly obvious this century, and starting from George W. Bush, his father was one of these people from the head of the CIA, formerly president. At the time, as we mentioned in the last podcast episode, at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, he was someone who wanted and was very aware that the U.S. needed to develop a new, let's call it the New World Order, some new structure moving forward. And so you could argue that he's definitely instrumental in getting his son elected, and his son, people remember there was shenanigans in the 2000 election in Florida.
That was the Chad issue, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that was Al Gore lost by the slimmest of margins in that one to bring in Bush. And then we had, the 9/11 incident in New York, which led to the Iraq War. And people also don't necessarily remember, although watching Simpsons episodes is sometimes helpful. But at that time, it was still the Republicans, because George W. Bush was in power, that were sort of being blamed on resurrecting, having dead people vote and pets vote and everything. That was one of the Simpsons episodes. And they brought in the voting machines, right? And you look back, those evil Republicans. And if you look forward to today, all of that is now those fingers are being pointed at the Democrat Party, right? And there isn't, if this was proper party politics, then you wouldn't expect the two parties to behave so similarly in such important key areas, right? When Obama came into power, I thought for sure he was going to remove the voting machines if he's any kind of reasonable leader, but he doubled down on the voting machines, and that was a red flag for me right away. And then if you follow his presidency through, you think, well, this is actually a pretty terrible leader, to be honest. If you look at all the things that happened during his presidency, basically it's all of the worst things that we're dealing with now, effectively, right? The entire social collapse of his country, that was under Obama. That wasn't under Trump. It was just sort of blamed on Trump. Trump's a convenient scapegoat. And so you have the establishment, the powers, whatever, seem to have kind of picked the left as their horse to ride to victory for the next while. But if that goes sour, you can bet they're going to try and put in an establishment Republican as well, right? Because there's clearly a schism in the Republican Party right now, and some people think that Nikki Haley is let's say the Republican Hillary Clinton, maybe. So I don't know.
It's an interesting question. How, as you say, if they are choosing their candidate, why are they not better at it? Why? I mean, I didn't know enough about Hillary Clinton to know that she was, bad news for anyone who wants their side to win. But why did the people who really picked her fail in that way, or were they just not in control of the primary system? Was she not expected to come through at top in the
it almost feels to me like that they had their names in a hat or on a list, and it's like, okay, it's your turn, or you haven't had your turn yet. Like Joe Biden tried to be president twice before and failed both times, right? So the people told him twice, no, we don't want you. This time they kind of pulled out all the stops, but why pick Biden? The guy also had stroke multiple times too. And he had another one, during that whole campaign. And if you look at him 1 year before the 2020 election and then after the 2020 election, it's a different person, right? And so that could be another conspiracy theory, but
and also it could be an issue when they were talking about Biden and Trump, that being the election in November. I mean, it's possible that one or both of them might no longer be with us in November, which obviously is a major change to the situation.
And that brings up other issues, because you're suggesting obviously naturally might not be with us.
Yes.
There's as the what many people have termed the Trump derangement syndrome, as that sort of, if Trump manages to get around all the stuff, the roadblocks that are being put in his way right now, and actually manages to lead the Republican Party into the election, that's going to flare up a lot of people's Trump derangement syndrome to a pretty high point. Most people forget that there was actually a half assassination attempt on Trump. It was buried almost immediately by the media, and strangely enough, it was a British guy. So you're like, what the heck was going on? Is this like some kind of weird CIA hypnotic plant?
Certainly
or
buried enough
something?
that I hadn't heard about it. But
yeah,
that's another kind of random factor
yeah,
that in history, but not so random if you create the media impression of, this man is going to destroy the world. But paradoxically, the man who wants us to pull out of NATO is the arch hawk, and
that's the weird thing, right? So I think what happened was Trump blindsided the establishment. He kind of like in the world wars, right? Each war has been using new technology that caught the other side by surprise. I think Trump used social media to catch the other side more or less by surprise. There was hints that Obama in 2012, that whole campaign used social media very subtly, but Trump obviously went much harder on it. I think he blindsided them, caught them by surprise, and then they were just using his sort of natural divisive character to then go hard on him. And basically everything they pinned on Trump was essentially, all the big issues they pinned on him were more or less stuff that was already either in process or in discussion by previous governments. Like if you look at some of the big issues, like the wall.
Yes.
If you look at the
border
children,
it's not going on to empty ground. I mean, there is a wall there,
and it's been discussed before. I mean, it's all in process. A lot of the stuff that Trump was doing was not actually that original. He was taking playbooks out of Obama's. I think in many cases playbook, with exception of saying, I think he approached it like, okay, we can be like Obama, but we can do certain things better. Like we wants to pull out of the wars. Okay, so we can promise that we're going to leave the wars, and we're going to promise that we make the rest of the world pay what they should be paying. And that comes sort of back to what we talked about in the last episode of the U.S. as the global policeman, right? So they were paying for everything. The whole system falls apart. They don't want to pay anymore. Essentially, that was sort of where it was going. But he was being blamed. There are still people who think that Trump is the evil, mastermind behind the children in cages on the border. And you're like, well, what's the first thing that Kamala Harris, when the Biden administration came into power, Kamala Harris was put in charge of the border and checking it. What's the first thing she did as a person in charge of that border? Well, she went on a tour of some other country overseas. She never visited the border for like 2 years. They don't care. They only used it to make people upset at Trump, right? So that's one of the things. And then now they're actually starting to build the wall. Right? Like the Biden administration, which came down so hard on Trump, now they're starting to build the wall. And the vaccine is another issue, right? So they say, oh, would you take a vaccine that made by the Trump administration? I don't think I would. But it's the same vaccine. So how are you? So it doesn't make sense. So it's sad that certain people, even intelligent people, seem to fall for a lot of this stuff. Yeah. And that's disturbing.
And given that they do, the assassination risk is what we talk about, must be real for both of them. And I would have to say he was quite brave to have taken out the head of the Republican Guard there. Where, I mean, that must put him at the top of the hit list for agents of several organizations, but certainly any influence Iran has in that direction will unless they hope he will raise the temperature. But then he isn't actually that hawkish. I mean, Biden has been fairly solid behind Israel, hasn't he? And behind, more so behind the Ukraine possibly than Trump would have been.
Oh, definitely. I think with Biden and Ukraine, that's been, again, building since the Obama administration. I think there was a connection there. And so Ukraine more or less did whatever they wanted after Biden. And Biden admits, he's on camera admitting that he threatened the government basically with withdrawing billions in support for them if they didn't make a political change. So they made the change and they got the money. So that connection has been there since 2014. I would be certain to say, like you just said, that the Biden administration, which I'm claiming is the establishment. It's definitely more behind Ukraine than Trump's administration would have been. There are some differences, definitely, yeah, in relations to China. I assume as well would be a big difference. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm the thing was if anyone, yeah, you wouldn't even have to attempt to knock off Biden. You don't know how much longer the guy has. With Trump, yeah, we'll see what happens. I think it depends on what happens. But the strange thing with Trump, in my perspective now, as I've been feeling that more and more of these events of the last 3-4 years have been scripted, it almost feels like we're living inside a novel where certain stories, certain parts of events start happening and they feel scripted. It's like, the Russia attacks Ukraine. Well, we knew they were going to attack that, so we had plans in place already. We managed things. Boris Johnson keeps that war going for whatever reason, right? We're safely away from it here in the West, in the UK and the US, sitting comfortably away from where the fighting is, while we just sort of feed the fires with money and weapons, basically. And as it's felt, the whole thing has felt sort of slowly unwinding, right? Then once that one's properly under control, okay, you ignite the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Okay, now that one's getting it's managed somewhat. We'll leave it another 6 months, and then we'll ignite the China conflict. It's begun to feel to me like Trump is also scripted into this narrative as an anti-hero or as the villain, either way. And we all know he did a stint. I mean, he was in The Apprentice, right? It was his show in the U.S. Reality show, and so I can't help start to feel that and it causes me a bit of concern that he might be part of the process as well, right? As an outlet, perhaps. This is what Fox News was in terms of the mainstream media. So all the mainstream media is basically aligned on one side. Fox News was the steam valve, right, for the people who didn't agree. They were the outlet on the other side. Then they messed that up, but that's another story. And so I can't help but feel that this is even more scripted than I was concerned that it was. And then that bothers me to quite a large degree.
And his role in the script as the dangerous warmongering American leader and a Republican is quirky from a British point of view. Because in a sense, I'm sort of remembering that image from Vietnam, where America is the imperialist country, warmongering, bombing Vietnam, etc. Under a Republican president. You expect the Republicans to be the warmongers, the Democrats, the peace-loving, dove-fancying people. And you think, well, no, Hank, actually, Trump doesn't want to get involved, and suddenly that is the dreadful thing. This man doesn't want to get involved in overseas wars. How bad can an American imperial leader be?
And that's the crazy thing about the narrative they put on Trump, because it's exactly like you say. And there are still people who strongly believe Republicans are the party of war, and you're like, you've been hoodwinked now. I mean, literally there was a Republican president who pulled out of the Iraq war. Who was pulling out of NATO, say, pay your own defensive way, who's bringing back to U.S., who was, removing themselves from war, negotiated 4 peace treaties with Israel in North Africa and the Middle East. And you pin him as the warmongering leader. And you have to, now in hindsight, even those people who believe that have to see that they were misled, right? Because the Biden administration, almost as soon as they came in, started up the war machines again, right? And it was only 2022 when it was 2022, I think, when Putin attacked. And prior to that, they were already getting the war machines in place, right? They already knew what was going to go on. And some evidence for that is that there was a variety of significant numbers of American politicians who started investing in the war manufacturing, the weapon manufacturing companies. So the war machine, we've now flipped like this. The positions have been flipped by, let's call it the establishment if you want, whatever. But the Democrats are now the party of war, right? And it's opposite to when we grew up, that they were always supposed to be the party of peace, we thought. And now they're very obviously the party of war. In fact, to the point where they're like, okay, and Trump was asked by, like, I think it was a CNN or MSNBC, I don't remember, reporter, okay, so which side do you hope wins, Ukraine or Russia? Basically, that's paraphrasing the question. And he was like, I think we should stop the war and stop people from getting killed. And then she kept going, which side, Ukraine or Russia? It's like, no, he's giving the right answer, right? You don't want the war. You should be against the war. You shouldn't be at for A or for B, right? But that's what they've done to the American population now. They've tribalized them so extremely that they can't even see the middle ground anymore, many of them.
And I'm sort of seeing Biden on the war side now in relation to Israel. I mean, I'm on record and stand by saying, you know, I'm not calling for a ceasefire. I'm not even calling for a bombing halt or a shelling halt. But you know, because it's right that, you know, it's the right to carry on the war against Hamas is legitimate. But I would be very much for saying, but it has to, you know, you have to apply proper scrutiny of the collateral damage, and which means largely conducting it as an infantry war, which I never thought, you know, I thought they were bluffing about the ground offensive. You know, they wouldn't accept the casualties, but in a sense they would need to accept more if they were going to do it by infantry alone. But I would expect America to be withholding munitions and saying, no, we want to see your collateral, you know, if you bomb or shell, we want to see what, you know, just what, you know, what your justification for that was. And, and I must say, I'm less confident in the Israeli goodwill in the sense that, hang on, 3 Israeli hostages couldn't surrender to your infantry without being shot down. You know, that doesn't suggest a very circumspect approach to the battle, which I know, I mean, circumspection and battle don't normally go well together, but I mean, that was, I mean, even Israelis must think, well, that wasn't good.
Yeah, I think this is a dangerous development from my perspective anyway, in the current wars, is the almost ignoring civilian casualties now, or even the fact that civilians are somehow now a focus, right? So Ukraine was weird because okay, there wasn't a huge number of civilian casualties, but almost immediately it's like evacuate Ukraine. 10 million Ukrainians, like a quarter of the country left, basically, which is bizarre, right? And then you go into the Middle East, and they don't seem to be any concern for people on almost either side, really. It's purely just what can we get. And the interesting thing to me is, if you go back again, as we were talking with Bush, George W. Bush, what was the famous phrase with regards to the Iraqi war? Was the axis of evil, right? And the axis of evil, if I remember, was like Russia, Iran, and North Korea, right? Yeah. So what do you got? You got a war with Russia. You have a war now with Iran because Hamas is backed by Iran. And what's the next one? Well, North Korea is sitting there right close to China, right? Those are basically on the same side. So this, again, feels like it's still a continuation. It's still someone wants to get rid of, put these groups, let's say, down for sure, and reset certain parts of the world, which, you know, brings me to the Great Reset, which we won't discuss at all here, because I don't know how much that's related directly, but there definitely seems to be a plan like this. That's why I keep feeling that this is all orchestrated, which is why I'm very certain we will see a war somewhere in the region of China within the next 2 years. But maybe we'll leave it on that note, unless you wanted to add anything.
I think that explores my knowledge of it, and certainly, you know, wisdom on the American election.
It's gonna be a very interesting, let's say, year and a half, I suspect.
Yeah, I would say in passing though that your comment about the cartoon program featuring people with voting pets irks me slightly, because I have a running pseudo argument with a friend in which I advocate votes for dogs. I think he doesn't know I'm joking, but the fact that the Simpsons have preempted me in that is where.
Yeah, in this case, a lot of the pets were dead as well.
Oh, so right, that was the other thing. But I haven't gone quite that far.
But with the 2020 election, a lot of people were saying they were registered to vote in multiple states at the same time. And so the whole thing comes full circle to the Democrat Party, basically, right? Manipulating things. But again, so we'll leave it there, I think, for the American election this year. So thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed, please like, share, and subscribe to Doublethink Dialogues. And we'll talk to you in the next episode.